Atheists piss me off. They act all smug and act like their beliefs make them better than us delusional theorists, but when you actually break it down, you soon realize they're the truly delusional ones. In fact, their delusions are so extreme that they rival those of flat earth believers. Yeah, I went there. What's up, guys? Acerthorn here, and this is my latest hot take. So what even is an atheist? Well, I'm only going to be unleashing my criticism today at the brand of atheists who piss me off, so I think it's important that we establish exactly who those people are, lest anyone come to this video and feel personally attacked by its mere title and premise before they even hear my arguments. For purposes of this video, an atheist is anyone who falls into one of four categories. You only have to be in one category to be covered by this video, but if you self-identify as an atheist, or even as an agnostic, in my experience, 99.99% of them will fall into at least one of these four categories. Category 1. Those who boldly claim there is no God. I'm not talking about those who were on the fence about God's existence. I'm talking about those who actively take the definitive stance that no, there is no God. They say it loud, they say it proud, they say it with their full chest. In their view, it's a signed, sealed, and delivered verdict, etched in stone, no appeals. These people piss me off because they treat anyone who disagrees with them on this fact as just uneducated, stupid, and delusional. And yes, sometimes they literally use those exact words, like this lady.
Do you really want to talk about delusional beliefs and forcing those on others when you literally believe in and talk to an imaginary sky daddy?
Or perhaps the case of Professor Dave Explains, a scientist who I first discovered when I noticed his videos dedicated to debunking flat earthers. In his video where he purports to debunk creationists, early on in the video, he states the following.
Positing the general existence of a deity is a philosophical position that can't be firmly proven or disproven in any empirical manner.
So I posted this comment. He responds by calling me stupid. Wow, what a fucking asshole. You don't know a damn thing about me, Professor, and yet you assume that the only reason I could possibly have developed any worldview that is even slightly different from your own is if A, some random person just told it to me with no evidence, and B, I immediately believed it without any persuasion or resistance from me, simply because I'm too naive and gullible to do anything but blindly believe whatever total strangers tell me, regardless of context. From your point of view, I could literally be walking down the street and an unmarked van could pull up beside me with three men wearing ski masks and carrying chains, telling me that there's $1 billion in cash inside this van that I can have, no strings attached, if I just climb into the back of the van and take it. And there is a 100% chance that I would instantly, and without the slightest hesitation, leap into the back of that van in search of that cash, because that's just how naive and gullible I must be in order to believe in God. And that the same is true for literally every other theist in the history of Earth who ever existed from 50,000 BC to the present. In your opinion, it is physically impossible for anyone to believe in God and not be that naive and gullible. Fuck you.
Nope. Sorry, Kevin Bacon wasn't in Footloose.
What? Of course he was.
No, he wasn't. You lose.
Of course he was. He was the star.
Nope, you're wrong. Look it up.
I don't have to look it up. It's common knowledge.
Nope.
He was on the cover of People magazine when the movie everyone knows Kevin Bacon was a star of Footloose. It was a huge movie. He was the lead.
At the start of this video, I mentioned that atheists are on par with flat earthers in terms of their stubborn refusal to abandon their delusions, and this is the first of many examples I will bring up in this video. Professor Dave says that I just heard someone tell me that a long time ago and I instantly believed it without question? Gee, I wonder where I've heard that before. Oh yeah, I've heard it from flat earthers. They insist that we, who believe in a round earth, just learned it in school, believed it instantly without question, and never bothered to question what we were taught in school because we're stupid. So that's the first category of atheists that I'll be covering in this video. The second category is only slightly less pompous and arrogant than the first. They are the ones who don't quite declare with 100% certainty that there is no God. They just insist that there's no evidence for God. These people are only slightly less infuriating to deal with than the first category of atheists, as they at least try to justify their arrogant, punk-ass beliefs on a little more than just you're so stupid that you believe in something that clearly doesn't exist. A profound lack of evidence for something would indeed be a good reason not to believe it if, and this is the biggest if in the universe, this supposed evidentiary vacuum were actually true. However, it very clearly isn't true. And to show you what I mean, let's have a look at what this category of atheists are actually saying on a more fundamental level. They aren't saying that the evidence we offer to support our belief in God is insufficient to persuade them. No, they're saying, with their full chests, that the evidence in support of the existence of God is literally zero. They can't even point to anything and say this is unpersuasive because, according to them, there's literally nothing to point to. Absolutely zero evidence. Reading would be helpful. Zero proof. In all capital letters. Bring me proof of that. There's no evidence. Zero evidence. This is one of the most infuriating things you can possibly say, because even a cursory review of the matter can quickly show how fucking wrong that is. Tell me, to those of you who fall into this second category of atheism, if there is literally zero evidence for God's existence, like you claim, then what the hell do you call the Holy Bible? I'll be discussing objections to the Bible in the very next section in this video, but for the time being, suffice it to say, the very fact that this book exists at all means that Category 2 atheists are inherently denying reality itself when they say there's zero evidence. According to their logic, the only way they can be sincere in their claim that there's zero evidence for God is by insisting that the Bible doesn't even exist. Not that it's made up, or that it's unreliable, but that it literally doesn't even exist at all. Some atheists who aren't Category 2 may argue that the Bible is unreliable or made up, but at least they acknowledge that it exists. So that's Category 2 atheists. Category 3 atheists are those who make various accusations against various proofs offered by theists to attempt to debunk them. These are slightly less insufferable than Category 2 atheists because they at least accept that the Bible exists and qualifies as an evidence. However, this category of atheists are still wholly insufferable because whenever they try to make any allegations in order to try and debunk what theists say about the Bible and the history surrounding it, yeah, believe it or not, there's actually evidence besides just the Bible, and I'll be scratching the surface of some of that evidence later in this video. They almost never provide even one iota of evidence themselves. Literally, Category 3 atheists have precisely as much evidence in support of their arguments as Category 2 atheists claim there is in support of theism. I'll be referencing these guys a lot in this video. What's most infuriating about a lot of Category 3 atheists is that they actually provide arguments and rebuttals that, if they were proven to be true, would indeed be strong points in their favor. The Roman Empire would never have buried Jesus in a tomb. The 4 Gospels weren't written until hundreds of years after they were purported to have been written. These are powerful arguments that would indeed significantly dilute Christianity. Now, if you could just prove them, you might actually get somewhere in this debate. Instead, Category 3 atheists tend to simply make the claim without any evidence and leave it at that. And then, when we're not convinced because they've done literally nothing to convince us, they act like we're the irrational ones. The final category of atheists that I'll be discussing in this video are Category 4 atheists. Those who acknowledge that there is some evidence for God, but they place the threshold of evidence so high that nobody could possibly satisfy it. Hell, even they themselves rarely, if ever, acknowledge any level of evidence that they would accept. Instead, they tend to be all like, well, if God exists, he knows what evidence would convince me and he'd provide it. In fact, the opposite is true. If there is a God, then it would naturally follow that his sovereignty over us is both infinite and absolute. If it wasn't, he wouldn't even be God, would he? And at that point, it would follow naturally that he doesn't owe you, personally, a damn thing. Frankly, while the vast majority of atheists claim to be rational and willing to accept evidence if it was presented to them, in practice, very few of them actually are as open to evidence as they claim to be. The few that are as open as they say they are tend to not be atheists for very long. Case in point, Josh McDowell, the author of the More Than a Carpenter series of books, which gets re-released every couple of years with updated arguments. He initially sought to disprove Christianity by going straight to the horse's mouth, researching in the very locations the Gospels were actually set. Rather than disproving Christianity, he found the complete opposite, that Christianity is rock-solid truth. So yeah, it's extremely rare to find an atheist who truly is as open to evidence as they often shout from the rooftops as being, and the few who are tend not to be atheists for very long. So those are the 4 categories of atheists that I'll be shitting all over in today's video. I'm sorry this intro was as long as it was, but the groundwork needed to be laid. In the next section, I will tackle one of the most common arguments that atheists like to make when trying to debunk theism.
There's just no evidence for God, man. This whole I don't understand it, so God must have done it is your typical God of the gaps hogwash. No evidence, or do you just reject any argument for God given to you because you subjectively decide that you don't want to be convinced by it? Bro, if it was convincing evidence, I'd believe in your God. But the evidence you have is crap. What if God pulled you out of this universe Charles Dickens style and somehow showed you behind the curtain of everything he's created? Would something like that convince you? Well, for all I know, that could be some kind of alien life force that pulled me out of my existence to do that. So what you're saying is, even though you are shown something that can't be explained by nature, there could always be another explanation for something. Yeah, I think you got that right. So God can't prove himself to you because no matter what he does, for you, something else is always possible. Well, God can do anything. He should be able to provide me evidence that will convince me. But do you see what you're doing there? To be convinced of something, there needs to be a point where you say, yes, I'm convinced. And you've removed any possibility to be convinced. This extreme skepticism has removed your ability to be reasonable, because based based on your demands, we can't prove anything really. I can't prove my pharmacist isn't going to poison me the next time I go for a prescription. Doctors have these things called track records? Oh, you mean evidence that I could also be hyper-skeptical about? Like I could say the doctor's credentials could be forged. But that's not realistic. So being reasonable does matter. Well, yeah. Okay, sure. Let's say there could be evidence that would convince me. It would just have to be really, really good evidence. Something that has no naturalistic explanation? Sure. Okay, that's good. But your problem is, you've now stepped into God of the Gaps. I think I need to think on this for a while. Please do.
Whenever I meet an atheist online, 99.99% of the time, the first thing they say to me is, prove it without using the Bible. By it, they obviously mean the existence of God. But they always include those last 4 words, without using the Bible. They always include that condition before I even have a chance to even offer the Bible as evidence, which means they've already decided that the Bible isn't good enough, probably because they are Category 2 atheists, but maybe some of them are Category 3. Anyway, they always declare this restriction on my evidence, but they never bother to explain one key important detail. Why can't we use the Bible? Yeah, they never really explained that part. Seriously, why can't I use the Bible? This is a wholly arbitrary restriction that exists for no other reason than to limit my options because fuck you. It would be like challenging a chess grandmaster to prove he's as good as his title suggests by challenging him to defeat you without using the queen. Why would he agree to such an arbitrary restriction? And why would you, in good faith, seek to impose it on him? Frankly, an atheist saying that the Bible isn't a valid source to prove Christianity is the equivalent to a flat earther saying that NASA and scientists aren't valid sources to prove the Earth is round. Whenever us sensible people listen to a flat earther do his rambling nonsense, they'll often demand proof from us that the Earth is in fact round, but they'll always add an annoying, eye-rolling caveat to their demands for proof. NASA and scientists aren't valid sources. Why not? Well, says the average flat earther, because those people are obviously in on the conspiracy. Obviously, this is ridiculous. However, if you actually take a step back and look at the matter without any preconceived biases or predetermined outcomes, there's really no good reason to treat atheists any differently when they say the Bible isn't a valid source for proving Christianity. Either both NASA is a valid source to prove the Earth is round and the Bible is a valid source to prove Christianity, or neither are valid sources for their respective points. There is no in-between. When I previously made this comparison, some people, who I can't show screenshots because they blocked me on TikTok, smugly declared that it's actually more comparable to the Harry Potter books not being valid sources to prove that Hogwarts is real. I replied by saying that was totally different because the Harry Potter books never purported on their face to be non-fiction. The troll, who apparently is a Category 3 atheist, replied and said, "Well, that just means the Bible is out and out lying about what it really is." I replied by saying, "Prove it." I then made another comment clarifying, and by prove it, I mean prove not just that the Bible is fiction, but that it's out and out lying. Remember, there's a big difference between being wrong and lying. He blocked me immediately after that, so I can't show you the screenshots. I could switch to a private window, but then I'd have to remember which video it was on. So yeah, he's definitely a Category 3 atheist, as evidenced by the fact that he claims something with 100% confidence, yet fails to provide even an iota of evidence. Anyway, it just goes to show how little actual thought so many atheists have actually put into their beliefs, despite shouting these beliefs from the rooftops like they're, well, for lack of a better term, like their gospel. Many atheists smugly insist that it's my burden of proof to prove that my Sky Daddy is real. Well, my best evidence is the Bible. But alas, that evidence doesn't count. Why not? Because fuck you, that's why. Look, buddy, I accept that I have the burden of proof when I'm making the claim that God exists. But then, when I present you with evidence, and you insist that this evidence is out and out lying, well then, you are the ones who are making the claim. That means that you hold the burden of proof, not me. If you're in court and the prosecution brings forth a witness that says you did the crime, and you want to claim that this witness is out and out lying, then it's the job of you and your lawyer to discredit that witness through cross-examination, not the prosecution's job to anticipate every conceivable avenue that the witness's credibility could even theoretically be attacked and account for that in his direct examination, as opposed to redirect examination, which takes place after your cross-examination.
Christians often have this misconception that we need to debunk every claim made against Christianity, and that's not really true. If they make a claim, they need to back it up with evidence. And if they don't, it's not necessarily your job to do a bunch of research to show the claim is wrong. Make them do their own research, and until they do that, just simply point out there's no reason to take their claim seriously.
A slightly less common argument they make for why I shouldn't be allowed to use the Bible is because you can't do it without using the Bible. First of all, that's horse shit, and I'll be going into more detail in the next few sections, but even if that were true, that I cannot prove God's existence without using the Bible, why does that necessarily mean that I shouldn't be allowed to use the Bible? Think about it this way. Imagine if we were having a debate over the US Constitution. You claim that the reason Congress has two chambers was a result of a compromise so that larger states would have disproportionate representation in one house, but small states would have equal representation in the other house. I disagree, and so I challenge you to prove that this is the reason for the bicameral legislature. But more importantly, I challenge you to prove it without using James Madison's journals. Because you can't do it without using James Madison's journals. And that last part is 100% true. The Founding Fathers met in secret because the job they had undertaken was controversial for its time. They were supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation, not replace them. So James Madison's journals are the only written records we have of the day-to-day discussions that happen behind those closed doors. So if you toss out his journals, you have no proof at all of what the Founding Fathers were thinking when they included any provisions in the Constitution, let alone the Great Compromise which led to the bicameral Congress we have today. But does that mean that anyone seeking to prove that shouldn't be allowed to use those journals as proof? Of course not. That would be preposterous to suggest that. And yet, when atheists say effectively the same thing about the Bible, they say it with their full chest. But, okay, let's assume that I can't use the Bible because reasons. So when people challenge me to show proof, I usually link them to this playlist from Inspiring Philosophy, which explains all the evidence that the resurrection of Jesus really happened. In fact, I highly recommend you give a lot of his videos a look. He is by far my favorite apologist on YouTube. But of course, whenever I try to offer that evidence, Category 4 atheists always swoop in and act like this doesn't count either. Why? Because if a YouTube video counted as evidence, then anyone could make their own videos to rebut them. Yeah, that's it.
A video series posted by an account called Inspiring Philosophy is not proof of anything. By your logic, I'm gonna make a video and post it on YouTube saying, fuck Jesus, I am Jesus' dad, I am God, and thou shalt worship me. By your logic, I'm about to become your God.
Oh my god, some people are just impossible. Listen here, you little shit. I didn't provide that playlist simply because it said what is convenient to my narrative. No, I selected that playlist because it based its argument on facts that are subject of near unanimous consensus among scholars of antiquity. Moreover, he repeatedly cites two scholarly sources, actual scholarly ones, to back up his claims. Tell me you didn't even watch the playlist without telling me you didn't even watch it. At this point, there's no point in even trying to reason with them. I could point to the numerous books published by scholars of antiquity, but then again, you'd probably say that's not reliable for the same reason the Bible itself isn't reliable, because it's written down in a book, and therefore it's necessarily just as reliable as Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. And if it purports on its face to be non-fiction, well then, it's just out and out lying about what it is. So, books aren't reliable evidence. YouTube videos aren't reliable evidence. So apparently, nothing is valid evidence.
This is mine, and this is mine, and that's mine, and this is mine.
If you instantly dismiss any and all evidence solely on the possibility that it might have been faked, just about everything in the world needs to be summarily dismissed as potentially fake until proven otherwise. Take, for instance, evidence presented in court. If you think about it, virtually nothing we typically accept as evidence is 100% fake-proof. Witnesses can perjure themselves. CCTV camera footage can simply be actors dressing up and acting, especially considering the obscure angles that CCTV cameras typically show in order to get maximum field of view, often making it near impossible to get a clear high-res shot of the perp's face. Smartphone footage can be AI-generated deepfakes. Even DNA and fingerprint forensics have the potential to be faked. Most people on a jury couldn't read or understand DNA or fingerprint results if they were shown any, so whenever that evidence is presented at trial, it's not actually the DNA or fingerprints themselves that are the evidence, but rather a forensics expert testifying about whether or not they were a match. And with that comes the aforementioned possibility that the witness may perjure herself, like in this case. So, if you insist on dismissing any evidence just on the possibility that it could be fake, without any objective empirical evidence that it, in fact, was faked, you are about to fall down one truly endless rabbit hole. Here's something you can do to help give you a visual demonstration. Take an empty glass, head down to the beach, and scoop up a glass full of beach water. What percentage of the entire world's water supply is contained inside that glass? That is probably the amount of evidence we accept as true on a daily basis that would remain so accepted if we dogmatically dismissed any evidence that had even the potential to be faked, but which we haven't personally verified to not be fake. This is why Category 4 atheists are so damn insufferable to me. It would be one thing if they just said, "Nice try, but I'm still not convinced," and leave it at that. I mean, it's your everlasting soul that's at stake here, not mine. But no, all of these atheists, not just Category 4 atheists, spend the majority of their time out and out harassing Christians like me, calling us delusional and believing in fairy tales, when in reality, they're the ones who are hypocritically refusing to entertain a level of evidence that would convince them 10 times over if that same level of evidence were applied to any other scenario, such as if they were serving on a jury. If you want to squander your everlasting soul, that's your business, but leave us alone and let us be happy in peace. So for the 1% of you who haven't tuned away because, gasp, you actually agree that Category 4 atheists are full of shit, and maybe you are one of the actual handful of Josh McDowells of the world who might actually be open to hearing evidence and not holding God to an impossible standard, let me just gloss over all the extra biblical evidence to support Christianity. Bear in mind that the rest of this video will only be scratching the surface of all the evidence that's out there. By all means, do your own research just as Josh McDowell did. Just be sure to keep the open mind that you insist you have.
No, totally. Harry Potter books and the Bible are exactly the same. They're just made up fairy tales, except, the Bible was written by 40 people over 1,500 years in 3 different continents and 3 different languages, but somehow still had 63,776 cross-references, all talking about the same exact things and making predictions about the future, like the Euphrates River drying up, and mentioning scientific things it could have possibly not known, and debunking Islam 500 years before it exists, and being historically accurate with, like, Pontius Pilate and people of the time, and also being accredited by other sources and studied for thousands of years. But, like, it's literally the same.
Let's get the most basic thing out of the way. Jesus of Nazareth existed. Alright, that's a done deal. Jesus of Nazareth existed. Now, if you're one of the admittedly large number of atheists who accept this cast iron objective fact, you can go ahead and skip to the next section. But there are still a surprisingly large number of atheists, mostly category 2 and 3 atheists, who still to this day insist that Jesus never existed at all, divine or otherwise, or at the very least that there's no evidence that he existed. It's clear that these people have done precisely zero research into the matter, despite evidence being easily obtainable from a simple Google search. You say you don't see any evidence that Jesus ever existed? Well, where exactly did you look?
Well, I looked a bit, but I didn't find any.
A bit? What does that mean? Where did you look?
On the table and stuff.
You looked on the table for
archaeological evidence that Jesus once existed?
Yeah.
Gee, did you find any?
No.
Let me just go down the list of just a handful of peer-reviewed books written by well-respected scholars of antiquity that should thoroughly put to rest any dispute that Jesus, the man, was merely a myth, as long as you're not such a stubborn jackass that you refuse to entertain any evidence that challenges your worldviews. Bear in mind that this is just scratching the surface, and there are countless sources out there if you got off your lazy, fat ass and did just a wee bit of research. In his book, Jesus Remembered, Christianity in the Making, scholar James Dunn writes, 2 facts in the life of Jesus command almost universal assent. One is Jesus' baptism by John. The other is death by crucifixion. In his book, Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography, scholar John Crossan says that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. In his book, Jesus, An Historian's Review of the Gospels, scholar Michael Grant says, to sum up, modern critical methods fail to support the Christ myth theory. It has again and again been answered and annihilated by first-rank scholars. In recent years, no serious scholar has ventured to postulate the non-historicity of Jesus, or at any rate very few, and they have not succeeded in disposing of the much stronger, indeed very abundant, evidence to the contrary. In her book, Jesus in History, Thought, and Culture, scholar Leslie Holden says, among New Testament scholars and historians, the theory of Jesus' non-existence remains effectively dead as a scholarly question. In their book, Jesus Now and Then, co-authors Richard Burridge and Graham Told said, there are those who argue that Jesus is a figment of the church's imagination, that there never was a Jesus at all. I have to say that I do not know any respectable critical scholar who says that anymore. In their book, The New Encyclopedia of Unbelief, Co-authors Tom Flynn and Richard Dawkins say, by around 1920, nearly all scholars had come to regard the case against Jesus' historicity as totally discredited. In his book, The Blackwell Companion to Jesus, Delbert Burkett says some skeptics have maintained that the best account of biblical and historical evidence is the theory that Jesus never existed. That is, that Jesus' existence is a myth. Such a view is controversial and not widely held even by anti-Christian thinkers. In his book, Varieties of Religious Invention, Founders and Their Functions in History, Patrick Gray says, Christian and non-Christian scholars alike now almost universally reject the Christ myth hypothesis. That Jesus did in fact walk the face of the earth in the first century is no longer seriously doubted even by those who believe that very little about his life or death can be known with any certainty. I could go on like this for ages. I could probably fill an entire 12-hour video, the longest video that YouTube currently allows, consisting entirely of these sorts of rapid-fire citations of scholarly sources. I could probably go a full 12 hours doing nothing but that, and I still would have plenty of scholarly sources to spare. But why should I? You're not going to listen to me anyway, no matter how many sources I provide. These are books, and therefore are just as reliable for proving their contents to be true as the Harry Potter books are to proving their events are true. And if I point out that these books are non-fiction, you'll just say that these books are out and out lying about being non-fiction, while providing fuck-all evidence to support that claim. Because that's just what you do.
Y'all do understand that us Christians don't get anything personally out of you coming to Christ, right? Like, we don't get anything out of it personally. We just want you to know Jesus because we know what Jesus has done for us. If you make the decision to come to Christ, like, that's not like, oh, I got someone to sign up, I get a bonus check. I don't get any money, I don't get any power, I don't get anything from you coming to Christ, except for just pure joy knowing that you get to know Jesus. I'm not trying to force anything. I just know the goodness of what Jesus has done for me, and it breaks my heart to think of other people not living in that.
Now, for my next piece of evidence that atheists are sure to flat out ignore, here's the ultimate mic drop for you. The resurrection, that is, the event where Jesus rose from the dead 3 days after he was crucified, is a concretely proven historical event. And it is proven not because the Bible says it, but because the archaeological evidence says it. Now, before I continue, I want everyone to ask themselves this. If it could indeed be proven that the resurrection really happened, would that convince you that A, there is indeed a God, and B, Christianity is the religion he wants us to follow? If even that would not convince you of that, then you can just stop watching this video right here and right now, because at that point, you really are the epitome of the Category 4 atheist that I've been bashing this whole video. In fact, this one piece of evidence is the be-all, end-all when it comes to proving or disproving Christianity. It single-handedly renders moot nearly all other indictments that Category 3 atheists often like to spout to debunk the Bible. The story of Noah's Ark is incompatible with modern geological findings? Well, Jesus still rose from the dead. The records of ancient Egypt don't corroborate the story of Exodus, and yet Jesus still rose from the dead. The Bible contains all of these supposed inconsistencies, and motherfucking Jesus still motherfucking rose from the motherfucking dead. Nothing else matters, because as long as this one thing can be accepted to have happened, Christianity is the one true religion and there's no two ways about it. By contrast, If you can manage what nobody in 2,000 years has ever managed to do, and prove that the resurrection didn't happen, then you would have single-handedly debunked the whole of Christianity all in one fell swoop. In fact, the Bible itself outright tells us the path to debunking it. Yeah, unlike you Category 4 atheists, the Bible actually tells us what evidence we, as Christians, should be persuaded by. Specifically, in 1 Corinthians 15, 12 through 17, where it says, "Now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins." So there it is in black and white. You want to disprove Christianity and convert billions of Christians to atheism all in one swoop? There's your ticket. You got it straight from the horse's mouth. And yet, so many of you, to this day, still resort to debunking various Old Testament stories, which weren't even meant to be taken literally in the first place, completely ignoring the path that the Bible literally handed to you on a silver platter. By far, the most common argument I hear from uneducated lay people who don't have any expertise in archaeology, antiquity, or history is the Mythic theory. That is, the theory that the Gospels were made up a long time after they were allegedly written. Hundreds of years later, in fact, and were written by anonymous authors, only for the cult leaders of the time to claim they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, respectively. Now, there's actually a good reason why this theory isn't advanced by anyone with any actual credentials. Because it's provably false, and anyone with even an iota of credentials to their name can quickly and easily tell that. What, you honestly think professional historians don't have a way of authenticating ancient manuscripts? If they didn't, then how do you think we know anything about ancient times? Tell me, do you believe the 7 wonders of the ancient world used to exist, even though 6 of them are no longer around? If so, then why do you believe the other 6 used to exist? Because I got news for you, the evidence that the Gospels were actually written by the 4 ascribed authors, and were written at the time periods they claim to be written by, is many times greater than the manuscripts which purport to document the 7 wonders. Professionals have a wide assortment of methods at their disposal, such as stratigraphy, seriation, and many, many others, all of which proves that the Gospels were written less than 30 years after Jesus' death, aka at a time when Jesus' ministry and crucifixion would still be in living memory. More importantly, they are generally considered to be extremely historically reliable. As I pointed out earlier in this video, atheist turned Christian Josh McDowell outright calls the books of the Bible some of the most reliable writings in all of antiquity. I would also like to encourage you to check out this playlist from Inspiring Philosophy, which discusses the reliability of the Gospels in great detail. But really, you don't even need expert archaeological credentials to be able to see that the claims that the Gospels were made up hundreds of years after the fact are untrue. In fact, if you actually stop to think about it, even from a purely layman point of view, this theory makes absolutely no sense. Think about it. Category 3 atheists always omit one very important detail from this allegation. When exactly did the first copies of the Gospels originate? If they weren't from less than 30 years after Jesus' death, when memories of his life, ministry, and crucifixion were still recent enough to be contained in living memory, then when the hell did they originate? You Category 3 atheists never tell us that, because you know damn well you don't have a clue yourself. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that Christianity was first invented by Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor. He first rose to power around 306 AD, so that certainly qualifies as multiple centuries thereafter. Not to mention that it is unanimously attested to that Constantine is the first Christian emperor, so Christianity necessarily has to have existed by that point. So however late you want to say Christianity was invented, it had to have been on or prior to his coronation. So let me get this straight. Constantine, at the start of his rule, just created out of thin air this totes brand new religion that nobody had ever heard of before, and he even wrote, or at least commissioned others to write for him, this entirely new holy book that he out and out lied to his public that this holy book is actually a compilation of 66 separate books. And even though none of these people have ever seen or even heard of this religion or any of these books, Constantine assured us that this has always been the case for as long as they've lived, that they've spent their entire lives with Christians surrounding them, and literally everyone just believed him? Just like in George Orwell's 1984, when the inner party declares that Oceania has always been at war with Eurasia, and literally 100% of the people instantly believed it, noticed the pro-Eurasian propaganda posters that they had previously erected themselves, and assumed it was the Brotherhood who must have put them up there and immediately rushed to tear them down. So too did the Roman population at the start of Constantine's reign completely brainwash themselves into thinking that Christianity had always been around since before they were born. Is that what you're basically saying? I thought you atheists were supposed to be rational. Maybe you could make the argument that Constantine used the fact that he was, the emperor, in order to enforce his Christian religion onto others with an iron fist. But even if we assume that his efforts to stamp out any and all dissent and literally modify the memories of his subjects were literally 100% successful, when literally nobody in the history of the world has ever been that successful in convincing its own population of something their own memories contradicted, no matter how much political power he managed to seize, that would still only be effective at forcing Christianity onto people for the duration of his lifetime. The minute he croaked, you would expect evidence of his atrocities to come gushing out into the public eye like the fucking Hoover Dam. This leads me to my next and most important point of all regarding the mythic theory. The fact that no definitive, irrefutable proof has surfaced to this day, all 2,000 years later, is in itself irrefutable proof that it wasn't all a hoax. Don't you know that there's a literal scientific formula for precisely this sort of thing? Yeah, science, the very thing you atheists claim to champion until it doesn't support your narrative. It's called the Grimes equation, named after the scientist David Grimes, whose paper on the viability of conspiratorial beliefs sets an equation which tells us the probability of a hoax surviving for any considerable period of time before it's ultimately unveiled as a hoax. Using the Grimes equation, for example, people have been able to conclusively debunk the theory that the moon landing was shot in a studio. The two most important factors that govern the likelihood of a hoax or conspiracy being successful are A, the number of people who are in on the conspiracy, and B, the length of time that conspiracy has to stay secret. For example, if 5 men conspire together to rob a bank, that has a reasonable chance of succeeding because A, it's only 5 guys who need to keep their trap shut, and lay low in order to avoid leaking any evidence, and B, they don't have to keep it a secret for all eternity, just long enough for the statute of limitations to expire. With each additional person in on the conspiracy, however, the odds of it lasting for any length of time decreases exponentially, since it takes the unanimous efforts of every co-conspirator to keep it a secret, but it only takes one person blabbing, or even just inadvertently leaving evidence, such as lavish spending, for the cops to find, in order to blow the lid off the conspiracy. So, applying the Grimes equation to the theory that Christian religion was made up out of thin air centuries, not decades, but centuries, after the underlying events were said to have occurred, we have to accept the fact that no definitive proof that this was all a hoax has surfaced in 2,000 years. And no, Category 1 atheists merely insisting that it's a hoax while offering fuck-all evidence doesn't count as definitive proof. If Christianity is a hoax, it is by far the longest-lasting hoax in the history of mankind. The length of time alone makes it astronomically unlikely that it's a hoax, since this hoax outlasted not just Constantine's lifetime, but countless generations thereafter. This already astronomically unlikely event is made even more exponentially unlikely when you consider the number of clergymen who have to have unanimously kept this hoax going. I'm only going to include clergy because the low-level followers obviously wouldn't have access to the documents necessary to blow the lid off the conspiracy. But the clergy, even the lowest-level priests who are only in charge of a single chapel, most likely would. They are the outer party of Christianity, for lack of a better term. Anyway, the Catholic Church alone currently has over 400,000 clergymen. Bear in mind that this is just the Catholic Church, and this is just the number of clergymen at the present, not counting the countless clergymen who previously served in the past 2,000 years but are now dead. Bear in mind that the moon landing hoax, if true, would have required the unanimous cooperation of about that many people, and the Grimes equation says that it would almost certainly have been exposed in less than 4 years. Now, consider the fact that the total number of people, past and present, regardless of denomination, who must have been in on the Christianity myth conspiracy, who actively kept it under wraps for the past 2,000 years, is almost certainly in the literal tens of millions. And the odds that it has lasted this long without definitive proof being exposed long ago has got to be so astronomically unlikely that we would have to write the probability down in scientific notation with a negative exponent, because to write it down otherwise would require more particles than are in the known universe. Kind of like how a Googleplex has to be written in scientific notation with a positive exponent for the same reason. So, what exactly is it that atheists are saying was a hoax? Surely they don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but what exactly is the evidence that suggests that, which they claim was itself a hoax? What caused the first generation of Christians to believe that Jesus rose from the dead? The answer to that question is simple. The disciples of Jesus all proclaimed out in the streets that they had seen with their own eyes that Jesus had risen from the dead. Despite everyone, including the disciples, seeing Jesus die on the cross, they proclaimed loud and proud that Jesus had appeared to them 3 days later in a fully glorified body, clearly depicted as a conqueror of death. Now, at this point, you're thinking to yourself, why should we believe these disciples? How do we know they're telling the truth? And to answer that question, we have to in turn ask ourselves, why would the people they were directly preaching to feel any inclination to believe them? And the answer to that question is because the apostles suffered martyrs' deaths because of what they preached. We have to understand that the Roman Empire of the 1st century AD was a very different world than the world we live in. Nowadays, we have these pesky things called First Amendment rights. This means that heretics like Peter Popoff can't be prosecuted criminally for spreading their heretical, fraudulent garbage. So when Popoff eventually got exposed as the fraud he was, the only real consequence he faced was bankruptcy. This legal protection empowers heretics to shoot their shot, since they have minimal consequences even if they get caught. But in the 1st century Roman Empire, the apostles risked far worse if they spread ideas and speech that the establishment didn't like. Roman citizens couldn't be executed for anything other than treason, but unlike today, citizenship wasn't given out indiscriminately to anyone born or naturalized in the country. It was an exceptional privilege, and in the year 33 AD, which is when apostles first started proclaiming that Jesus had risen, only about 1 to 3% of the Roman population were citizens. Everyone else could be executed without trial if they so much as stirred up too much anger among people for preaching things they didn't like hearing, or even just for pissing off one person as long as that person was of high enough status. It is widely accepted by scholars of antiquity that the apostles died martyrs' deaths as punishment for their at the time radical and heretical preachings. As Sean McDowell, son of aforementioned atheist turned Christian Josh McDowell, writes in his book, The Fate of the Apostles, examining the martyrdom accounts of the closest followers of Jesus, a commonly used argument points to the apostles' willingness to become martyrs. Popular apologists frequently cite their deaths as good reason to trust the sincerity of their testimony, since it is difficult to believe they would go willingly to such gruesome deaths for the sake of empty deceit. Now, tales of the martyrdom of the apostles tend to have minor alterations from one source to the next, but the martyrdom itself is widely agreed upon. For example, Joshua Sharkelturl, whose name I have almost certainly mispronounced, in his peer-reviewed internet article titled How Did the Apostles Die? Did they die for their faith? Explains that there are varying sources as to why exactly St. Peter had opted to be crucified upside down. Some say he didn't feel worthy of dying the same way Jesus did. Others say it was meant to symbolize how he, a mere mortal, had been corrupted by sin, whereas Jesus wasn't so corrupted. However, regardless of the reason for the preference, antique sources are all in unanimous agreement that, after multiple non-lethal attempts to get him to shut the hell up about this resurrection blasphemy, they ultimately resorted to sentencing him to death in order to silence him. And the sources all unanimously agree that Peter not only did not protest his execution, but literally walked into his crucifixion with his head held high. Similar stories regarding the deaths of all the apostles receive a similar amount of consensus among scholarly sources and original manuscripts that have been uncovered over the millennia. Put simply, anyone who wants to debunk the resurrection, and therefore debunk Christianity, pretty much has to explain the martyrdom of the apostles if they plan on getting anywhere in their attempts to debunk the resurrection itself. So when Category 4 atheists are confronted with this evidence, by far the most common theory postulated at that point is the hallucination theory. In their peer-reviewed internet article, Could the Disciples Have Been Hallucinating When They Saw the Risen Jesus? Co-authors Zach Breitenbach and Daniel McCoy, each of which are PhD holders, write, to get around the strong evidence for this particular fact, some have proposed the possibility that the disciples, in their grief, had hallucinations. Now, this is a popular theory among the agnostics of the world because it relies entirely on the apostles' subjective perceptions and, therefore, cannot be affirmatively proven or disproven by objective empirical means. You can prove that there's no elephant in the room, but you can't prove that Jimmy doesn't honestly see what he thinks is an elephant, right? Except it totally can be objectively disproven, and anyone who says otherwise is totally full of shit. Think about it, you fucking dumbass. If it was truly impossible for anyone to ever know with even modest certainty what anyone was thinking, then how the fuck is anyone ever convicted of premeditated murder? Yeah, never thought about that, did you fucking cocksuckers? See, a lot of Category 3 atheists cling to the hallucination theory like it's their fucking firstborn, because it's the one theory that they think can't be affirmatively disproven, so you'll insist that it's the case until you're confronted with irrefutable proof, which you think is impossible. At that point, they become a hybrid of Category 3 and Category 4 atheists, which makes you doubly insufferable in my eyes. However, your belief that the hallucination theory can't be affirmatively disproven is based on a profound lack of understanding of how hallucinations actually work. Bear in mind that, in order for the hallucination theory to be true, it would have to be a shared hallucinogenic experience among over 500 eyewitnesses. As Breitenbach and McCoy explain, there is real doubt about whether collective hallucinations of any sort are possible at all. Meanwhile, the apostles claim that Jesus ate and drank with them, which in turn means that they noticed food and drink disappearing from the table and from their stores. As Breitenbach and McCoy explain, hallucinations cannot produce changes to the physical world as would be the case with eating food. Put simply, you honestly have a better chance of insisting that this whole thing was a great big 2,000-year-long multi-million person hoax, and all the statistical improbabilities that entails, before you can seriously insist that the apostles' belief that Jesus had resurrected can be adequately explained by hallucinations. But even if we ignore all of that, and assume that the hallucination theory has even a 1 in a million chance of being true, there's still another factor that puts the kibosh on what little remaining plausibility the hallucination theory may have, and it renders it truly impossible as an explanation for the martyrdom of the apostles: the empty tomb. Lest we forget that Jesus was actually buried in a government-owned tomb. This means that the exact location of the tomb was on record with the government. Now, a lot of Category 3 atheists insist with their full chest that Jesus was in fact not buried, but that his body would instead have been thrown into the ditches for dogs to eat. However, remember that these are Category 3 atheists we're talking about, so, of course, they provide fuck all evidence to back up this claim. If they did, they wouldn't be Category 3. Of course, even a cursory attempt at doing one's own research quickly reveals that Jesus did indeed receive a proper burial. But then again, doing one's own research is clearly beneath such exalted people as atheists. So with that definitively proven, to the satisfaction of everyone except Category 4 atheists, we then have to ask ourselves, if the resurrection didn't actually happen, and the apostles had just hallucinated it, why didn't the government at the time put the kibosh on the apostles' stories through the simple expedient of cracking open the tomb, pulling the body out, putting it on a cart, and running that cart down the streets of Jerusalem for all to see? Maybe the apostles wouldn't have shut up about the resurrection if they had done that, but virtually nobody would have been convinced of the apostles' testimony if they could clearly see with their own two eyes that Jesus was in fact still dead. The only explanation for that is that there was no body to produce. The tomb was found empty. Of course, some people may accept that Jesus was buried, but then still try to speculate about how it could be possible that no body was found, suggesting that the body was stolen, or maybe that the government had lost track of which tomb he was buried in due to a bureaucratic error or something like that. Frankly, at this point, it's clear that atheists are just randomly throwing theories at the wall as soon as they can think of them in a desperate attempt to find one that sticks. If the apostles stole the body, that would mean that they knew full well that their claims of resurrection were false, which sets us back to square one with the question of why they would willingly endure gruesome, martyr-like deaths rather than retract the statements they knew full well to be false. Meanwhile, to suggest that they simply didn't know which tomb it was because of a bureaucratic error is a stretch in itself. First of all, it would be a miracle of resurrection proportions in its own right to suggest that this bureaucratic error just happened to coincide with the largest mass hallucination in world history that just happened to lay the groundwork for Christianity to take root. Remember that in order for a mistaken tomb location to be relevant to any discussion, we first have to assume that all 12 disciples had the exact same multi-sensory hallucinations over the course of 40 whole days, which is already an astronomically unlikely explanation to begin with, and then we're adding an idea that's already pretty fucking unlikely on top of that, just to make even that idea work. Honestly, you have a better chance of shuffling a deck of cards thoroughly and ending up with the exact same order you started with than there is the odds of those stars aligning so perfectly. And for the record, the odds of that card shuffling thing happening are 1 in 52 factorial, an astronomically unlikely number. Put simply, by this point, Occam's razor starts to take effect, and atheists' repeated, increasingly desperate attempts to throw theory after theory against the wall in hopes that one will stick start to become more and more nakedly transparent as the desperate Hail Marys they truly are. Occam's razor, the philosophy that the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions is usually the best explanation, compels us to accept that the resurrection did actually happen. After all, that only requires us to make one assumption, that there is indeed a God. But of course, atheists will never concede to that no matter the evidence, because they're atheists and therefore, by definition, impossible to reason with.
I want 100% evidence that Jesus raised from the dead, because if you cannot give me that, then that makes the Bible incredible.
Ma'am, I don't base my life on 100% proof.
Well, maybe that's your problem.
Oh, you do? You base your life on 100% proof?
Yes.
Oh, really?
That's why I'm skeptical of everything.
Really? So that means you take a chemistry kit to the pharmacy, and when the pharmacist hands you that bottle of medicine, you chemically analyze it to make sure there's no poison in there, right?
That's why I don't
Because unless
take
you have 100% proof, you would never dare take that pill and put it in your mouth, because maybe the pharmacist put poison in there.
Yes, I don't base it on 100%.
Right, thank you. So don't tell me you base your life on 100%
No,
proof. You
I'm
don't.
sorry.
None of us do. It's not possible. You can't. You can't do that.
All right.
You can't do that, ma'am.
While not nearly as infuriating as dealing with those who deny the resurrection happened, despite overwhelming evidence, it is still a fairly common occurrence that I encounter with the occasional atheist who tries to tell me that the Bible must be fictional because it is entirely at odds with modern scientific understanding. As I explained last section, this is ultimately a superfluous argument because, as long as the resurrection is proven to have happened, that alone proves that God is real to the exclusion of all other factors, so there's no need to discuss anything else. But I'll at least give lip service to this common argument just to demonstrate how fucking weak it actually is. This is one of the few times where I have to acknowledge that a good chunk of modern-day Christians are partially to blame. Some sects of Christianity, namely Bible literalists and young earth creationists, do Christianity no favors by denying science to an outright caricature degree. They don't piss me off to the same degree that most atheists do, but that's primarily because they're content just living in their own little bubbles and not bothering anyone else. Whereas most atheists feel compelled to harass and belittle us every chance they get, as demonstrated earlier in this video. However, whereas literalists and young earth creationists are partially to blame for being such an embarrassment to the rest of us, the atheists are still mostly to blame because even though these people represent an infinitesimal percentage of the total Christian population, atheists are all too happy to pretend like they represent the average Christian and scoff at anything we say accordingly. Literalists and young earth creationists may have planted the seeds for us not to be taken seriously, but atheists spent ages cultivating the farm, most likely knowing full well that it was an unfair representation of the rest of us and actively not caring, or perhaps even maliciously and disingenuously trying to poison the well. Just because a handful of Christian sects deny the whole of science because it doesn't fit their specific worldview, doesn't mean that all of religion is wholesale incompatible with science, full stop. Young earth creationism is incompatible with science, but that doesn't mean the totality of all religion as a general concept is incompatible with it. To claim that is akin to claiming that because a handful of men had raped a handful of women in separate isolated incidents, then it's fair to blame literally all men and presume them guilty until proven innocent of being rapists. Or in the alternative, just because some people like Amber Heard are proven to have out and out lied about being abused, that all women should be branded as liars by association. Put simply, religion is not at odds with science, any more so than math class in school is at odds with English class. Religion and science are two different schools of thought that tackle two completely different sets of questions. And I can hear some of you atheists typing away at the keyboard right now, screaming, "Oh, but Acerthorn, doesn't the Big Bang Theory contradict the creation story in Genesis?" Well, quite simply, no, it doesn't contradict that. But don't take my word for it, believe an actual scientist. Namely, one of the greatest scientists of all time, Stephen motherfucking Hawking. Yeah, in his best-selling book, A Brief History of Time, Hawking says outright, "An expanding universe does not preclude a creator." Thank you. Of course, atheists routinely point to various other supposedly supernatural stories in the Old Testament to try and discredit the Bible. They often point out how the story of Noah's flood is uncorroborated by modern geological research, how ancient Egyptian records fail to corroborate the book of Exodus, and so on and so forth. But you guys fail to realize that these passages were never meant to be taken literally. The Bible was largely written in figures of speech which were in circulation at the time. Yeah, nearly every Old Testament story you atheists bitch and moan about was a fairly common figure of speech at the time. Here's just one example to get you started, and you can do your own research from there. The Sumerian king Sargon of Akkad. As worldhistory.com says about him, his mother could not reveal her pregnancy or keep the child, and so she placed him in a basket, which she then set adrift on the Euphrates River. Gee, I wonder where I've heard that before. As the Metaphors of Movement website explains, the motif of a baby being placed in a basket and floated down a river generally symbolizes a child destined for greatness but whose early life is marked by danger and concealment. The river often represents the flow of fate, and the basket acts as a vessel of salvation, protecting the child until he is discovered by a figure who will aid in his upbringing. But even discounting that, there are places where the Bible itself states explicitly that it's meant to be metaphorical. I'm not talking about how anyone acting in good faith would notice that it's not supposed to be literal. I'm talking about instances where Jesus said one thing, his audience thought he was being literal, and Jesus actually backtracked and said explicitly, no, I'm speaking metaphorically here. John 3:3-5, and John 4:13-15 are two examples I can think of off the top of my head. Moreover, to say that Christianity is at odds with science is to out and out ignore all the contributions that Christianity made to the scientific community. A lot of people think that Christianity actively suppresses science by discouraging its members from thinking critically about the world.
Where are we?
This is Cohort, Brian. Same year, same time. But in this universe, Christianity never existed, which means the dark ages of scientific repression never occurred, and thus humanity is 1,000 years more advanced.
In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. To the contrary, Christianity was uniquely suited to encourage scientific discovery. In his book, The Genesis of Science, How the Christian Middle Ages Launched the Scientific Revolution, James Hannam writes, Christian theology turned out to be uniquely suited to encouraging the study of the natural world, which was believed to be God's creation. But some of you atheists cry out into the ether, if Christianity encouraged science, how do you explain the Dark Ages which happened just around the time Christianity rose to prominence? The answer to that is, it's not and it didn't. That is to say, it's not the Dark Ages, it's the Middle Ages, a distinction which will become apparent momentarily, and it didn't start at around the time Christianity rose to prominence. The Middle Ages began after the fall of the Roman Empire, which occurred in the 5th century AD, 500 years after Jesus lived, and approximately 200 years after Constantine made Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire.
200 years? What?
So how can you sit there and say that the rise of Christianity supposedly caused the Middle Ages when the two didn't happen even remotely at the same time? Moreover, it's actually a misnomer to call this period the Dark Ages because it's ludicrous to say that there was even any scientific stagnation during that time period at all, let alone any that can be blamed on Christianity. As James Hannam further writes, it's simply untrue to say that there was no science before the Renaissance. Later, he writes, the compass, paper, printing, stirrups, and gunpowder all appeared in Western Europe between 500 and 1500 AD. True, these inventions originated in the Far East, but Europeans developed them to a far higher degree than had been the case elsewhere. Meanwhile, the people of medieval Europe invented spectacles, the mechanical clock, the windmill, and the blast furnace by themselves. Lenses and cameras, almost all kinds of machinery, and the Industrial Revolution itself all owe their origins to the forgotten inventors of the Middle Ages. Put simply, there was no Dark Ages. What atheists refer to as the Dark Ages, because it gives them an excuse to shit on Christianity, was merely the Middle Ages, which is neither a good thing nor a bad thing. Get over it.
Inside of a mother's womb, there are two babies. The first turns to the other and says, "Do you believe in life after delivery?" The second baby replies, "Of course, there has to be something outside of the womb. Maybe we're just here to prepare ourselves for what comes next." The first replies, "That's absurd. What would life after the womb even be like?" Then the second says, "Well, I don't know, but maybe it's a lighter place. Maybe we can walk with our legs. Maybe we can eat with our mouths." The first says, "Eat with our mouths? That's not possible. The umbilical cord is what provides nutrition and life." Then the second says, "Well, maybe mother will take care of us." The first then goes, "You really believe in mother? There's no evidence for a mother." The second says, "She's all around us. Without a mother, this world couldn't even exist." The first then says, "Well, I can't see her. It's only logical to assume she doesn't exist. If mother was there, she would reveal herself to give me hope." The second then says, "If you listen closely and you really concentrate, you can hear mother speaking. You can feel her love." But the first baby isn't convinced. Life after delivery seems far too different than life in the womb. He simply cannot believe.
In the already rare event an atheist is willing to concede that the resurrection happened and, therefore, that there is indeed a God, many Category 4 atheists all too often move the goalposts and say that they still refuse to worship him because he's a moral monster. I find this line of thinking to be hopelessly naive, because you are calling him a moral monster based on the set of morals that Yahweh himself instilled into humanity. It's like calling the Constitution morally bankrupt because it fails to integrate freedom of speech or equal protection to all people regardless of race. Morals which the U.S. Constitution itself invented and instilled into the values of all Americans. A lot of atheists proudly insist that they can be morally good without God. They often scoff at people who insist that there's no good or evil without God because they themselves hold true to Christian-like values, such as feeding the poor and not killing. This, however, is a pitifully naive and short-sighted understanding of just what we're actually trying to tell them. Seeing as Jesus often spoke in parables, perhaps it's only fitting that I use a parable to help explain this. Imagine you're having a conversation with some idiot. Let's call him Freddy. So Freddy tells you, you know, we don't really need the sun. We could totally survive without it. You rightfully say, that's preposterous. Where does light even come from if not from the sun? Freddy responds by pointing to two things, light bulbs and bonfires, and then says, see, these two things and many others like them prove that light can exist without the sun. You roll your eyes and attempt to explain to him those things are only possible because the energy for those things was stored inside fossil fuels and firewood, but that energy came from the sun originally. Freddy responds by sticking his fingers in his ears and going la 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 la. That is how you atheists sound when you try to tell us that you can be morally good without God. Sure, it's easy to say things like that in the 21st century English-speaking world, where you've lived all your lives in a society where these morals have permeated nearly every aspect of daily life, so it's easy to forget that these morals haven't always been the norm. They're not universal to all of humanity, and they don't exist per se. Lest we forget that, by the time Yahweh had caught up with Abraham and started the religion of Yahwism with him, humanity had descended into absolute depravity. Things like slavery, pedophilia, known as pederasty back then, and even child fucking sacrifice were the norm back then. Historians and archaeologists who actually know what the fuck they're talking about routinely credit the rise of Christianity and its corresponding morals with doing away with such practices. In his book, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, Tom Holland writes, "Today, the West remains utterly saturated by Christian assumptions. Our morals and ethics are not universal, but are instead the fruits of a very distinctive civilization. Concepts such as secularism, liberalism, science, and homosexuality are deeply rooted in a Christian seedbed. From Babylon to the Beatles, St. Michael to #MeToo, Dominion tells the story of how Christianity transformed the modern world." So the next time you cite a highly cherry-picked scriptures like Exodus 21:20-21 without proper context to support your conclusion that the Bible is pro-slavery, please actually make sure you know what you're talking about before you start running your goddamn pie holes, you insufferable know-it-all cunts. One of the most common arguments atheists make for Yahweh being a moral monster is that he casts people into hell who don't worship him. How can an all-loving God cast the very people he claims to love into an eternal torture chamber full of fire, lava, and pitchforks? What kind of infinitely loving God would subject someone to infinite suffering and death just for finite sin in life? The answer is quite simple. He doesn't. Do you people even know exactly what hell even is? Did you just see artistic depictions of hell in movies and just assume that must be what the Bible actually says about hell? Ironically arrogant coming from people who routinely criticize us Christians for just blindly believing everything other people tell us. No, what hell actually is is being eternally separated from God and His love, where your soul is left to simply rot in its own sin for all eternity, like a landfill for souls. This is literally the Catholic Church's official definition of hell. To die in mortal sin without repenting and accepting God's merciful love means remaining separated from Him forever by our own free choice. This state of definitive self-exclusion from communion with God and the blessed is called hell. Put simply, God doesn't send people to hell. He saves us from hell. As C.S. Lewis writes in his book, The Great Divorce, all that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. For more information, I encourage you to watch Inspiring Philosophy's 35.5-minute in-depth video discussing this topic. Like I've said multiple times, this video is only meant to scratch the surface. Anyway, next on the list is the fairly common argument that if God exists, why don't He just stamp out all the evil in the world? And why does He allow good people to suffer? These indictments are typically two heads of the same beast, so I'll address them both together. Put simply, the Bible itself outright tells us the answer to this question, and does so just as explicitly as it tells us that its stories are meant to be metaphorical rather than literal, as discussed earlier. Proverbs 19:3 tells us, "A person's own folly leads to their ruin, yet their heart rages against the Lord." See, God has given us standards to live by and guidelines to follow. Love your neighbor, feed the hungry, heal the sick, clothe the naked, forgive your brother. Then we go around and break His commandments every chance we get. We pay the price for our own sinful recklessness, and then we have the gall to blame God for the suffering we brought onto ourselves? Do you honestly think there would be so much gang violence and wars in the world if we all loved our neighbors as ourselves like Jesus commanded? See, you want God Himself to stamp out all the evil in the world by His own power, but you don't want to take any responsibility for causing the very problems you want Him to wave a magic wand and fix. Meanwhile, you want to continue down this self-destructive path but not have to suffer the consequences because they want God to clean up their messes while giving Him nothing in return. You're like a spoiled child who wants to eat nothing but sweets all the time, every day for the rest of your life, but not have to live with the health consequences that naturally come with that. And then you blame your parents for not taking care of you when your teeth rot and you suffer a heart attack from the obesity, knowing they warned you multiple times that this was going to happen if you continued down this path. Furthermore, are you really sure you want God to get personally involved in stamping out all the evil in the world? What if He started with you? What if every time you had sex out of marriage, or lied to your boss about mouthing off at a customer so you don't get fired, a bolt of lightning came down from the sky and struck you dead right then and there? Is that what you want? See, you want God to stamp out the evil that you recognize, but only based on your personal determination of what is good and evil. But at that point, you don't want a God. You want to be God. So once that logic is thoroughly debunked, atheists' next attempt to move the goalposts is to point to all the various genocides he does in the Old Testament to prove that he's just as evil as Hitler. Wait a minute. What the hell? I thought you said you wanted God to stamp out all the evil in the world. Now when He does exactly that and kills off entire cities like Sodom and Gomorrah for being wicked, all of a sudden He's an evil genocidal maniac for doing that? For fuck's sake, talk about damned if He does, damned if He doesn't. There's literally just no pleasing you fucktards. Why can't you just pick a patch and stick with it? Why are you always so goddamn inconsistent? Pick what? Are you intentionally trolling us? Good God, I'm trying to understand you. Really, I am, but you just don't make any goddamn sense. What do you want from God, you son of a bitch? What do you fucking want? Okay, Deep breath. Let's try and address this. When we read these Old Testament stories, in addition to having to keep in mind that the majority of the Bible is meant to be metaphorical, we also need to constantly remind ourselves that God is, by definition, the perfect judge. Because he exists outside of our space-time continuum, he has an omniscient understanding of the facts of each case infinitely better than anything we, as mortals, could ever hope to have. To help illustrate what I mean, let's turn to one of the few times we, as mortals, can have something even remotely resembling the level of omniscience and hindsight that God has: video games. Specifically, let's look at one of my personal favorite video games, The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and even more specifically, let's look at the quest In My Time of Need. One of my earliest videos on this channel was a video where I took a side in that quest and argued my case for it. There are still, to this day, people who debate as to whether Sadia or Kamadu is in the right. I myself have done not one, but 2 live stream debates on this channel regarding this specific quest. Now, in the first debate I had at timestamp 1513 to 1529, I say the following about Skyrim's lore. Now bear in mind that according to Cicero's journal, Hammerfell does not have an active Dark Brotherhood branch at all. So, if they want someone dead and they would go to the Dark Brotherhood, they'd probably just go to some random band of mercenaries. The only way I could possibly know that is by playing the Dark Brotherhood questline in that game. However, from the point of view of the player character, he couldn't possibly know that, and therefore couldn't possibly have factored that knowledge into his decision unless he had already joined the Dark Brotherhood. But if he had done that, then it makes no sense that he would give the slightest rat's ass who is guilty or innocent. He's a contract killer. He doesn't care the least bit about that. He's only going to care about either whatever gets him the most riches or whatever gives him the most people to kill. By contrast, we, as the players who are playing the game for our own amusement, we can play the Dark Brotherhood questline for fun and therefore become privy to that lore, while still being good guys overall. Therefore, we, the audience, can approach this quest primarily concerned with doing justice, but still be privy to knowledge that the player character in universe couldn't possibly have both known and cared about. Because we exist outside of that little space-time continuum that this quest is set in, we can get a bird's-eye view of the facts that those at ground zero in the quest could never possibly hope to achieve. So what does that say about God? Well, imagine if Yahweh was similarly tasked with deciding Sadia's or Kamadu's fate. If God exists, then he would have a bird's-eye understanding of the facts of the case that was infinitely more comprehensive than what even we, with our multiple playthroughs and corroborating with other players, could ever possibly hope to achieve. He would know exactly who Kamadu spoke to in order to get the assignment to either kill Sadia or bring her in, and he would even know exactly what Sadia had done to incur those people's wrath, the same as if he were standing right there the whole time. Was Kamadu working for the Aldmeri Dominion? Did Sadia speak out against the Dominion? Did she sell out the city to the Dominion? When Sadia's urn shows up inside Whiterun Catacombs, was that actually happening in universe, or was it just a game mechanic and scripting error? None of us have any way of knowing for certain, but if God was tasked with deciding the case, he would know all of these facts and infinitely more, no guesswork or detective work needed whatsoever. Not only is God infinitely knowledgeable of the facts, but he is also infinitely neutral. Unlike any mortal tribunal, whether they be judges, juries, arbitrators, sports referees, managers resolving employee disputes, anything, God is not subject to our mortal whims, such as bias, prejudice, nepotism, the need to avoid pissing off those in power, or even just the simple human need to have food on the table. God is above all of that. Nothing which sways our judgments in any case, however subconsciously, is entirely inapplicable to God's judgment. Put simply, even foregoing the fact that he is also infinitely loving and infinitely merciful, even discounting those traits, God is still literally the perfect judge. There is, and there can be, none more objectively qualified to be my judge, jury, and executioner. If the job must go to someone, then he is the one I would want it to go to. So to answer the challenge that all the genocides in the Old Testament that he either orders or directly commits somehow proves that he's a moral monster, the answer to that question is fuck no.
Atheists are just trying to gaslight God. Now, seriously, just think about this for a second. God gives Adam and Eve an entire garden to do whatever they want in. They literally can eat from whatever tree they want, do whatever they want. They don't have to worry about pain, suffering, nothing. With just one stipulation. God's like, yo, this is my house. You can do whatever you want. Just don't do this thing. Don't eat from that tree. And atheists will seriously have the gall to say, why did God put the tree in the garden in the first place? It's clearly his fault we're all suffering. You realize how stupid you sound. This is like my billionaire friend inviting me to come live in his mansion. He says I can do whatever I want. I don't have to worry about nothing. He'll give me access to his bank accounts. I can eat whatever food. I just gotta live and just enjoy my life and do whatever I want. But he says there's one stipulation. Don't eat his Cheerios. Those are his Cheerios. Don't eat them. And then what do? I go eat the Cheerios. And then I'm shocked that I got thrown out of his house. Walking around like, but if he didn't want me to eat the Cheerios, why did he put it in the house in the first place? That's how y'all sound.
So for the final section in today's video, I'd like to take a moment to address all the alleged harm that Christianity has supposedly caused. This is getting a separate section from Yahweh being a moral monster because I'm giving atheists at least a little bit of benefit of the doubt, far more than they actually deserve, and assuming that they're accepting that these alleged harms are caused exclusively by tragically misguided humans, and that God himself doesn't personally share in any of the blame. Although, let's be honest, 99% of atheists aren't going to admit to even that much. Even then, the actual harm that so many atheists allege is caused by Christianity is actually anything but. Most of this supposed harm is either A, heavily misconstruing the data, B, significantly overstating the actual harm caused, C, misinterpreting Christianity's role in the whole ordeal, D, are just bald-faced lies, or E, all of the above. In the extremely rare event that atheists ever actually bother to give any specifics regarding the type of harm allegedly perpetrated, they can usually be grouped into a handful of categories: LGBT persecution, oppression of women, and the Spanish Inquisition. Not even genocide in general, just the Spanish Inquisition, since nobody can really think of any other historically significant Christian genocides in the past 2 millennia. I'll cover that one first, since it's admittedly the worst of them all. Many atheists consider the Spanish Inquisition to be one of the most heinous atrocities in the history of mankind. But is it really? A moment ago, I mentioned that a lot of these supposed harms are actually just atheists significantly overstating the actual harm caused, and this is such an instance. Let me ask you, exactly how many people do you think were actually executed as part of the Spanish Inquisition? Considering that the whole thing lasted for 356 years, the death toll is sure to be absolutely massive, right? Well, in his book, The Spanish Inquisition, A Historical Revision, historian Henry Kamen gives us the hard facts, looking only at the cases that A, resulted in a conviction, where B, the defendant was sentenced to death, and C, that death sentence was actually carried out, rather than pardoned, commuted, or something else sparing the defendant's life. The total body count for the Inquisition comes out to an astonishing, grotesque, blood-curdling, heinous grand total of 2,000 executions. Yeah, that's literally it. Don't get me wrong, that's still 2,000 too many, but come on, people! That's over the course of 356 years! That comes out to literally less than one death every 2 months. At that point, that's hardly even a genocide. That's just a normal amount of executions in any given country, especially for the Middle Ages where the Eighth Amendment rights weren't a thing, and where executions typically occurred pretty soon after the sentences were handed down. Unlike today, where our courts tend to spend about 10 to 15 years reviewing death penalty cases for the slightest error. Of course, that's still 2,000 too many, especially when you consider that these executions were for little more than a refusal of the accused to convert to Christianity. However, we have to remember that in terms of genocidal atrocities committed in the name of Christianity, this is the absolute worst of the worst, and it's not even a close call. By contrast, I can think of one genocide right off the top of my head done in the name of Islam that surpassed that death toll in the course of one single solitary day. So honestly, why does Christianity get the lion's share of blame for genociding people who don't think like them? Oh, and if you want genocides, the Holocaust, which was a secular genocide, puts the Spanish Inquisition to absolute shame. Hell, even if you consider all the people who were even persecuted during the Spanish Inquisition, which was about 150,000, and you only consider the Jews who were killed in the Holocaust and don't count any non-fatal persecutions or any deaths for reasons other than anti-Semitism, the Holocaust still has the Spanish Inquisition outnumbered by a ratio of 40 to 1. And you have the gall to sit here and tell me that Christianity is somehow a blight on humanity that costs countless lives? Give me a fucking break. Okay, so the Spanish Inquisition wasn't nearly the atrocity that many atheists say it was. But what about the oppressions that are still ongoing? Oppressions we can see with our own two eyes. As I proceed to this next section, please understand that this video isn't meant to be comprehensive. It's meant to show you how atheists' delusions fall apart under the slightest scrutiny, because atheists are, by definition, utterly incapable of doing their own research into the matter, which makes them all the more insufferable when they hurl their ill-informed invectives towards us Christians like it's a goddamn snowball fight. In light of that, I'm just going to focus on the two big ones and leave you to do what atheists are utterly incapable of doing, which is doing your own research. Those two big ones, at least from my personal experience, are the treatment of LGBT people and the supposed oppression of women's rights. For the latter, it's pretty easy to debunk. I say supposed oppression because, quite frankly, nearly every conceivable systemic oppression of women has already been thoroughly abolished in the English-speaking world, and especially in the United States. Women's suffrage, that was put in the Constitution in 1920, literally over a century ago. Equal opportunity of employment, that's been the law ever since 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. The list goes on and on. Now, sure, there are lots of people in existence today who still have heavily misogynistic views, and maybe some people back in the 1910s were against giving women the right to vote because of inherently misogynistic beliefs. But those beliefs all acted entirely independently of Christian teachings. As far as actual tangible harm caused, however, those people don't have the power to do anything on their own, and Christianity does not promote it either. Of course, there are still plenty of places in the world where women are systemically treated under the law as second-class citizens. However, if you actually look at a women's rights map of the world, you'll find that most of those places are disproportionately in Africa and the Middle East, aka Islamic countries, where Christianity has little to no political influence.
I absolutely love how you're going to sit there and pretend that when I ask that question, what rights do men have that women don't, that you don't know damn well that I was talking about the West.
In fact, Loads of scholars who actually know what the fuck they're talking about agree that, on the whole, Christianity has actually been good for women. I won't go into detail here, so I'll just provide one source on screen right now, and then entrust you all to, and say it with me everyone, do your own research! As for the LGBT persecutions, that one is ever so slightly more difficult to explain away, but only slightly more so. At least with LGBT, we do occasionally see politicians claiming to be acting as they believe God wishes them to act, constantly introducing homophobic legislation. However, while a lot of these bills are homophobic on their face, they almost never get passed. Meanwhile, we see story after story pop up from time to time about overzealous parents who abuse or even disown their children after said children come out as LGBT. While this is certainly tragic, we need to truly understand, is Christianity itself, the religion, truly to blame for this? The answer is actually no. First of all, if you actually look at a global map of LGBT rights by country, you'll notice an astonishing pattern. Countries where LGBT people have the most rights are predominantly in North and South America, Europe, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. 3 former British colonies. Meanwhile, the countries where homosexuality is still illegal are disproportionately in the Middle East as well as North and Central Africa. In other words, the countries where LGBT people have the most rights are the countries that are disproportionately Christian, whereas the vast majority of state-sanctioned homophobia is concentrated in Islamic countries. Look, I'm not trying to undermine anyone's personal suffering. I freely admit that we still have a lot of work to do, and there isn't nearly enough equality in the world. But if you're looking for one thing you can point to as the single most common denominator that is the primary source for the majority of evil in the world, Christianity ain't it. Of course, that's just state-sanctioned LGBT rights and persecutions. What about what individuals do? Well, research indicates that this is caused by the exact opposite of what you probably think it's caused by. In his documentary video, Does Christianity Lead to Christian Nationalism?, Inspiring Philosophy points to numerous studies suggesting that it's actually more to do with those who self-identify as Christian but who do not regularly go attend religious services. In other words, everyone who self-identifies as Christian has a regular built-up tank of religious energy. But for active churchgoers, they get that out of their system each Sunday when they go to church, whereas inactive Christians tend to divert their religious energies elsewhere, with politics being the most common outlet. I'd also encourage you to check out this video from that same creator. Before I wrap this up, there's one final thing I'd like you to consider. Again, I'll only be providing one source, but I hope you'll do your own research afterwards. Research indicates that Christians tend to give more to charity, both in terms of physical donations and volunteer time, than any other religious group, and active church goers tend to be the biggest charity givers and charity volunteers of all Christians. So next time you want to rant and rave about how harmful religion is to society, let that sink in.
What if Christianity never existed?
Well, that would have been horrible for humanity, given that Christianity is responsible for so much of our moral progress, as well as increasing education and literacy rates, spreading democratic values, and was crucial for ending slavery. Without Christianity, we'd probably still be stuck with Roman age technology and morals, like thinking slavery was a societal norm.
Scientific discovery would have happened much faster with the Enlightenment period starting in the 12th century.
This is a modern myth invented in the 19th century and perpetrated by people who don't know history. Science advanced throughout Christian Europe in the medieval period. In fact, historians today note that Christianity was very important for the development of science. James Hannam said, "Christian theology turned out to be uniquely suited to encouraging the study of the natural world, which was believed to be God's creation." So no, Christianity did not slow down the development of science. It was actually crucial for science.
So in conclusion, if, in spite of all of this, you still refuse to believe, then that's your prerogative. It's your everlasting soul, not mine. It's not like it's anything important. But can you at least get off our dick about it? You've constantly hurled vulgar and belittling insults at us all day like it's a fucking snowball fight. You call us delusional, say we believe in fairy tales, and yet you're the ones who refuse to see reason to an extreme I've only ever seen rivaled by flat earth conspiracy theorists. It would be one thing if we based our beliefs off of literally zero evidence, but we don't. To the contrary, it's you atheists who dismiss literally any evidence we offer with a stubbornness rivaling that of flat earthers. You preemptively say we are not allowed to use the Bible to prove our claims because reasons. You rarely give us any reasons why we can't use the Bible, and you've never given us a good reason. You often make various accusations against the evidence we offer without ever providing a lick of evidence to support your claims. Yet you call us sheep for supposedly believing things without proof. Look, if you want an impossible level of proof to believe, that's your prerogative. As I said, it's your everlasting soul, not mine. But don't call us delusional just because we're convinced by a reasonable level of evidence that would overwhelmingly convince you of literally anything else in life, including whether or not your best friend you've known since you were 5 had just murdered someone in cold blood. The resurrection of Jesus 3 days after he was crucified is a concretely proven historical event. Anyone who wants to claim otherwise has to account for the fact that the apostles all died martyrs' deaths and that Jesus' tomb was found empty. Oh, and you need to actually back up your arguments with proof. If you just declare that Jesus was never buried to begin with and provide fuck all evidence to support your claims, you're no better than what you consider the average Christian to be. Christianity is not at odds with science. It actually fostered science much more than any other religion. God is not a moral monster, and your claims that he is are tragically misguided. And Christianity is not harmful to society. To the contrary, it has been instrumental in reducing poverty, increasing education, spreading democratic values, and Christians donate more to charity than any other demographic. So please, atheists, mind your own business and get off our dick. So get angry, call me a sheep, call me delusional, call me whatever you want. I guarantee that many of you will attempt to bring up plenty of these things I just talked about while commenting on this very video, proving that you didn't even watch any of it. In the meantime, however, I am Acerthorn, and I will see you guys later. Peace.